Hey everyone, today I want to talk about lenses. Ooh. Okay, so quick story. When I started recording and opened up my studio, I invested in a camera right away because I had a lot of clients that needed like videos and all that stuff, right? So I had to learn pretty quick about how cameras work, especially with DSLRs. And one of the first things that I had to learn was the different functions of a lens, right? This is such an important thing when it comes to photography. But anyways, so before you buy a lens, ask yourself a few questions. First of all, what are you shooting? What do you want to shoot will dictate what kind of lens you're going to buy, all right? So for me, I needed something that can handle low light because none of my studio space had really good light. So I needed something that had a low aperture, something that would let a lot of light in, right? Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is focal length, right? So that is, when you look at your lens, it might say 20 millimeter, 50 millimeter. So this is telling you the distance in which that it needs to focus. So the lower the number, the wider the angle. A wide angle would be like a 35, a 20, an 18, an 8. These are lenses that can get more of the image, right? Whereas a more narrow focal length, like a 300 or 200 millimeter, requires a lot more distance to focus on your subject. So if you are doing, let's say you want to film a grizzly bear, okay? You don't want to be close to a grizzly bear, you want to be pretty far. So you're going to have something with a farther focal length. Rule of thumb, if you're shooting from something from far away, you need a higher millimeter number. So 300 or 200. Whereas if you're shooting really close to something like a flower or a bug, you probably want to use a lower focal number, like 20 millimeter, 18 millimeter, 8 millimeter, okay? So there's this thing called forced perspective, and this has to do with the way a telephoto lens compresses, right? So this is used in films like Elf, The Gate, for those of you that know the movie The Gate, Lord of the Rings. The way they shoot it is you have your subject, and then maybe 30 feet away you have, or maybe 15 feet away you have your second subject, and then you go far away with your telephoto lens, and the image will compress and it'll look like they're in the same kind of plateau, right? So this is kind of a fun trick if you want to make like hills look really big, big moon or something like that behind your subject. You can use a telephoto lens. If you decide to do portrait work, you're probably going to want to use a lens like a 50 millimeter or a 70 millimeter. If you use a 20 millimeter or even a 35 millimeter, you might start to notice a distortion on the face. It might start to round out a little bit more. And that's just because of the nature of the lens itself. So you always got to keep that in mind. Or if you're doing landscape, you're probably going to want to use a really wide angle to get as much of the image as possible. Next thing I want to talk about is aperture, right? So this is measured in f-stops. So you probably notice when you buy a lens, it might say like 2.8, right? So that just basically, the lower the number, the more light it lets in. It basically is how wide the aperture or the iris in the lens opens up. This is a 2.8 millimeter, or sorry, this is a 2.8 aperture. My 50 millimeter is a 1.8. My 1.8 will let in more light, so I like to use it during evening shots or nighttime shots because it's easier for me to work with, right? I can have a lower ISO because there's more light coming in. You might have heard the term a fast lens. A fast lens just is basically referring to a lens that lets in a lot more light. So a 1.8 would be a faster lens than a 2.8. And the reason why it's called a fast lens is because the more light I can let in, the more I can increase my shutter speed so I get less motion blur. So if I'm filming race cars, I don't know why, and I want to have them look really clean when they come by, you don't want to be all blurry, so I can up my shutter speed and not worry about light as much. If I shoot with something maybe like with an f-stop of like 4 or 5, I can't increase my shutter speed as quick, so if I take a picture of that race car, I might notice it's a little bit more blurry. Another thing that the f-stop, the aperture affects, is your depth of field, right? So right now, things are kind of blurry in the background, but you can still see them, right? But if I use an even faster lens or something with a lower f-stop, I can blur this out completely and just have it focused on me, which is really cool. This is pretty popular nowadays. Like if you've been watching American Gods, which I recommend, it's pretty awesome. They're really big on this very, very narrow depth of field, and you can see they'll focus on maybe some writing and only a couple words come in, but everything else is blurred out. That's due to the aperture setting. Just be careful because the lower the f-stop, the harder it is to get your subject in focus, right? You have to be more exact. So if you're doing a lot of handheld stuff and you're trying to take a picture of a flower, a problem that I always have is it might not totally be in focus because I can't quite get that sweet spot. So the other two terms you might have heard are zoom lens and prime lens, right? So the difference between that is a zoom lens has different focal points. I can zoom in to 75 or 300 or whatever, and where a prime lens I can't. A prime lens is just a set focal point. So my 50 millimeter and my 24 millimeter here will always be 24 millimeter regardless. So yeah, one of the cool things about a prime lens is chances are it has a lower f-stop count. So I can go down to like 2.8, 1.2, whatever the lens is. Oh, when you're figuring out your focal point, also think of what your camera settings are at, or what camera you're using. I'm using a more entry-level camera. I'm using a Canon 60D, which has what's called a crop sensor. So the crop sensor is a crop of 1.6, which just means it's a smaller sensor. So that will change my focal point. So if I'm shooting with a 24 millimeter, it's going to be more of a focal point of a 40 millimeter, and my 50 millimeter is going to be more of a 70 millimeter kind of thing. So if you get used to that, it's not a big deal, right? If you're shooting with like a Canon 5D, it's a full frame sensor, so that doesn't affect that. So my 24 millimeter will be a 24 millimeter on a Canon 5D. But once you get used to it, it's not a big deal, but just keep that in mind because it could throw you off your game at first. If you found this interesting and helpful, I hope it was, please like and subscribe. I have a Twitter and I have an Instagram and a website. I have the links below. Thank you very much and happy cameraing.